and it tells drug traffickers not to plot their illegal activities in the U.S., and if they do, they will be brought to justice. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time. And before I do that, I do want to thank Mr. Schiff again for sponsoring this legislation with me, and I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to H.R. 313 and yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to H.R. 313, a bill that does not make us any safer in our zealousness to make drug laws as tough as possible. We're now considering an expansion of federal criminal law to conspiracies to engage in drug activity that occurs completely out of the United States. The reason this bill has been introduced, as the gentleman from Texas has pointed out, is at least partly due to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals decision in 2007 in the Lopez-Venegas case. The court overturned the conviction of two people who formed an agreement in the United States to transport cocaine from Venezuela to France. The court ruled that current law only applies to conspiracies to distribute drugs in which some of the activity occurs in the United States. Now, under this bill, some of the conspiracies could be prosecuted even if the drug activity that is the subject of the conspiracy is not illegal where the transaction is going to take place. For example, the use and the production and the distribution of marijuana for medicinal purposes are all legal in a number of countries, including Canada. Canadians and other citizens involved in legal medical marijuana programs in their country could face federal prosecution if they visit the United States and engage in agreements here in the United States to advance or finance their business in Canada. They could be discussing legal transactions in Canada, but the activity is illegal in the United States. So the agreement in the United States under this bill would constitute an illegal conspiracy and subject to all of the criminal prosecution, criminal penalties for drug transactions. In fact, someone would be better off just going to Canada and engaging in the legal drug activity than simply making arrangements with activity by discussing it in the United States. Now, unfortunately, the committee failed to adopt an amendment to exclude discussions of activity that may be illegal in the United States would be legal every place that the transaction is to take place. Now, if one believes that we do have an interest in covering some of these conspiracies under United States law, we should at least confine the law to cover large-scale trafficking. Unfortunately, the committee failed to adopt an amendment to do that. So even small transactions get caught up by this bill, transactions that are legal where they are occurring. And when they get caught up by discussing transactions that are legal where they take place, they're subject to draconian mandatory minimum sentences. And I note that it is an unfortunate fact under our criminal law that we rely too much on mandatory minimums. This bill would subject even more people to them. Mandatory minimum sentences have been extensively studied, and the conclusions in all of those studies show that the mandatory minimums are unjust, they cause prison overcrowding, and waste the taxpayers' money. The federal prison population is currently over 210,000 inmates, nearly a five-fold increase in just a few decades. And that explosion in population is due to a large extent to mandatory minimums. Mandatory minimums do not account for the individual circumstances of the crime or the defendant. The Judicial Council has warned us that if a mandatory minimum sentence is appropriate, it can be imposed without a mandatory minimum. But with the mandatory minimum, if it violates common sense, it has to be imposed anyway. In the past few years, numerous high-profile conservative leaders have expressed opposition to mandatory minimum sentencing laws. Some of those conservative expressions came from the Americans for Tax Reform President Grover Norquist, the American Civil Rights Institute President Ward Conley, National Rifle Association President David Keene, and Justice Fellowship President Pat Nolan, all of whom have called mandatory sentences into question. This bill is seemingly an effort to leave no stone unturned in prohibiting any drug transaction occurring anywhere, even if it doesn't impact the United States. There may be some parts of the bill that are worthwhile. It covers, of course, multi-million-dollar international drug conspiracies, but it also covers small transactions, and to the extent that people will be subject to long mandatory minimums for doing something that is legal, for talking about something that is legal where it's to take place, this bill just makes no sense and should be defeated. I reserve the balance of my time.
Mr. Speaker, we're prepared to close, and I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield such time as he may consume to the gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman from Virginia for yielding, and I'm pleased to join with my friend, the distinguished chairman of the Judiciary Committee, in supporting this bipartisan bill. Chairman Smith has been a leader on this issue, and we worked together on it in the prior Congress. This bill targets a narrow loophole in the Controlled Substances Act, which has been exploited by drug traffickers. And the case that in particular brings this home is the case that the chairman mentioned. In 1998, when two individuals conspired with Colombian drug cartels to traffic 2,000 kilos of cocaine from South America to Europe. They met in Miami to work out the details of this $100 million transaction. In 2005, following an extensive federal investigation, they were convicted of drug trafficking and conspiracy and sentenced to 24 years in prison each. However, in 2007, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals overturned these convictions. The court found that the way Congress had worded the conspiracy portion of the Controlled Substances Act meant that the conspiracy had to involve trafficking drugs to or from the United States, a condition that was not satisfied in that case. The result of the court's finding is that in the United States, a drug trafficker can plan and coordinate the shipment of millions of dollars of drugs between our friends and allies, yet be beyond the reach of our nation's laws. Mr. Speaker, I think this is clearly wrong and not the intent of Congress in passing the Controlled Substances Act. H.R. 313 would close that loophole. In doing so, it doesn't break new ground. Many criminal laws currently on our books have extraterritorial reach, including some portions of the Controlled Substances Act itself. Drug trafficking, by its very nature, is a global problem, and the laws and treaties that fight it must take that into consideration. When we look at the damage that drug cartels have inflicted in countries like Colombia and Mexico, not to mention the devastation their trade causes in the United States, the case for this bill becomes quite clear. The bill is narrowly crafted to apply only to those who conspire to traffic or distribute narcotics, and with the adoption of the manager's amendment in the Judiciary Committee, it was narrowed further to address concerns that conspiracy charges could apply to only those who sought to possess narcotics overseas. The bill will not open anyone to prosecution for simply discussing the possession of narcotics overseas. It deals only with commerce, not simply speech, the trafficking and distribution of drugs. Once again, I want to thank Chairman Smith for all of your leadership on this important bill, and I urge that we pass the measure, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
Mr. Speaker, I assume the gentleman is continuing to reserve, and I'll yield such time as he may consume to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank Mr. Scott, the gentleman from Virginia, for the time. And I want to thank Mr. Smith, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, for the way he runs his committee. He's an outstanding chairman and a gentleman. And I appreciate the fact that in this bill, which Mr. Scott has given much of the argument that I otherwise would have made about its failings, that Mr. Smith did accept an amendment to take the possession charges out of it. So possession of drugs is not in it, and that was an improvement. But nevertheless, one of the amendments that we did discuss in committee that still bothers me is that the activities could have been entirely legal in the country where they took place. Amsterdam or Holland. Holland is the country which I was thinking of, the Netherlands, and we discussed it in committee. Mr. Scott mentioned medical marijuana being legal in Canada as well as also in Israel. But a lot of drugs are legal in transactions in Holland, and if two Americans talked on the phone about going to Holland and buying some marijuana and maybe trading it with somebody else in Holland where it would be legal, it would be a violative of the law in the United States based on this particular statute. And that's what's called an overly broad law. when it captures conduct that really isn't intended to do. I don't think, and I would hope, that the people that voted for this didn't intend for it to criminalize speech when the actions in the country where the act took place was legal. I hope they wouldn't have been thinking that. And on the Judiciary Committee in particular, we should be very, very circumscribed in what we pass, because we're taking people's liberty from them. And liberty is one of the words inscribed up here, I think, in front of the panel. It's one of the things America holds so dear. This Thursday, we're going to be celebrating, or some of us will be celebrating in some ways, but we'll be observing regardless, the 220th passage of the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights gives people the freedom of speech and quite a few freedoms from government oppression and government activities. To suggest that this is a loophole, I think is a mistake. I think it was not intended by this Congress to criminalize behavior, particularly behavior that was legal in the country where it took place. In this situation that Mr. Smith describes, where some people got together in Miami to discuss drugs from Colombia that were flown from Venezuela to France and purchased in the Netherlands and Italy and elsewhere, I don't think they were in Miami because they thought that was a loophole. I think they were in Miami because they liked Miami. And why wouldn't you? Miami's a great place. They weren't there because it was a loophole. They just happened to be there. And I don't think anybody foresaw that as being illegal conduct. They could have discussed that in Paris or in Caracas or anywhere else. It didn't facilitate the crime per se. And I don't think that necessarily, and what they did was illegal in all those different countries, and they could have been prosecuted there. I would submit to you also that this nation and this world almost came to its knees because of derivatives and financial instruments created here in the United States, created here, not just talked about in Wall Street, but it had a global effect because those derivatives affected banks in Europe and all around the world. And as we almost came to our knees because of the criminal activities of people making lots of money with greed, gecko greed, other people around the world suffered as well economically. But we're not rushing here to criminalize talks between people in Wall Street and people in Paris about derivatives, about subprime loans, about ways to make money at the expense of poor people and possibly bring the world to its knees economically. But we are discussing the possibility of putting people in jail for going to Amsterdam and talking about buying some marijuana. Something smells foul, and that's why I oppose the bill. And I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself to such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, just finally, we can cover the international drug conspiracies with a reasonably drawn bill. Unfortunately, this bill not only covers the international drug conspiracies, but also, as the gentleman from Tennessee has pointed out, those who are ensnared by doing things that are legal where they occur, but if you agree to do it in the United States, it's all of a sudden a drug conspiracy. They'll subject you to all kinds of mandatory minimums. I would hope that we would defeat this bill, start from scratch, and draw a bill that covers what ought to be covered and leaves out what ought not be covered. Agreeing to go to Canada or go to Amsterdam to do something which is legal would not be a criminal conspiracy in the United States. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I hope we will defeat the bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let me try again to address some of the concerns of two of my colleagues on the Judiciary Committee. And I want to re-emphasize that extraterritorial laws do not require that the conduct be illegal in foreign countries. Congress has enacted numerous laws with extraterritorial effect. Our decision to do so rarely, if ever, hinges on whether the conduct is also criminalized in the foreign country. Once again, terrorism, drug-related money laundering, genocide, child soldiers, these are all extraterritorial offenses that do not require that the conduct also be against the law in a foreign country. Moreover, most extraterritorial statutes don't even require that the criminal engage in any illegal conduct inside the United States either. If they engage in terrorism or money laundering or genocide in a foreign country and simply come into the U.S., they can be prosecuted. The issue of conduct being criminal in a foreign country is not addressed in extraterritorial laws, but in extradition treaties. Also, extradition treaties do not require that conduct be illegal in foreign countries. Before the U.S. can extradite anyone for violation of U.S. law, it must first establish dual criminality, as required by most extradition treaties. Dual criminality is the principle that a crime in one country has to be a crime in the country extraditing you. If a drug trafficker engages in a conspiracy here in the U.S., but is later apprehended in a foreign country, the government will have to establish that dual criminality to extradite him back to the U.S. The extradition laws and treaties among the countries of the world properly provide for this. This principle is rightly excluded from this legislation because it already exists in federal law. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to also emphasize that the Obama administration fully supports this legislation. The Department of Justice supported similar legislation in the last Congress, and the Department of Justice stands by its position as expressed in the 2010 views letters and supports this legislation tonight. I urge my colleagues to support this very strong bipartisan piece of legislation, and I will yield back the balance of my time.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 313 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The gentleman from Ohio. Purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1905 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1905, a bill to strengthen Iran sanctions laws for the purpose of compelling Iran to abandon its pursuit of nuclear weapons and other threatening activities and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Ross Lieutenant, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Berman, each will control 20 minutes. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to claim time in opposition.
Does the gentleman from California oppose the motion?
The motion or the request, Mr.
The motion.
Speaker? I have no objection to the gentleman claiming time. I do not oppose the motion, and therefore I have no objection to the gentleman claiming time in opposition.
On that basis, the gentleman from Ohio will control 20 minutes in opposition.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker,
the gentlewoman from Florida is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from California, Mr. Berman, be allowed to control half of the time in the affirmative.
Without objection, the gentleman from California will control the time. The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend the remarks and include extraneous material on this bill. And I also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record my correspondence with the chairman of other committees of referral on this bill.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I thank the Speaker. I rise in strong support of the Iran Threat Reduction Act, which I introduced together with the distinguished ranking member of our committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Berman. I would also like to thank the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation and Trade for his key contributions on this bill. As is well known and articulated in the Declaration of National Emergency continued by successive U.S. presidents, the Iranian regime poses an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States. The revelation in October of Iran's plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the United States on our soil and in the process murder and maim countless Americans is a stark reminder of the regime's desire of a world without America. The exemplary work of U.S. officials foiled their plot, but the regime's threat remains. We would be naive to think that they will not try again. Meanwhile, Tehran continues to call for the destruction of our ally Israel while denying the Holocaust and making every effort to isolate the Jewish state. Ahmadinejad is more than willing to put Iran's money where his mouth is, providing weapons, money, and support for several terrorist groups, including Hezbollah and Hamas, which are waging war against Israel and our allies in the Middle East. And last month, the International Atomic Energy Agency released a report providing extensive evidence that Tehran has been working on nuclear weapons for years, despite repeated calls for the regime to abandon these efforts. Their hostility is evident and their intentions are crystal clear. We clearly understand the urgency of the Iranian threat. Many of our closest allies understand this sense of urgency, from the Israelis to the British and the Canadians. We tried the olive branch of engagement, negotiation, and diplomacy. And what did we get, Mr. Speaker? Diatribes against the United States and our allies and a plot to shed blood on our soil. The resolution passed by the IAEA Board of Governors in November does not even begin to cover the ground that we need. The resolution had no deadline for compliance by the regime and no consequence, just rhetoric. We need overwhelming, crippling sanctions against Iranian officials and their nuclear program, and we need those sanctions to be fully implemented with serious violations, penalties for their violations. We must undermine the foundations of the Iranian regime in order to compel it to abandon its deadly path. The Iran Threat Reduction Act closes loopholes in existing sanctions against Iran's energy and financial sectors, sanctions senior Iranian regime officials, and expands sanctions against those who help rogue regimes expand their dangerous weapons program. I hope that our members join us in stopping this dangerous regime in its tracks. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves the balance of her time. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent to put into the record an article from the Christian Science Monitor entitled "Used Car Salesman as Iran Proxy, Why Assassination Plot Doesn't Add Up for Experts," and also from Mother Jones, 4 Things You Need to Know About the Iran Bomb Plot.
Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent to put in the record a quote from Mr. Greg Thielman, former State Department and Senate Intelligence Committee analyst, who says that, quote, "studies are still going on, but there's nothing to indicate Iran is really building a bomb," unquote.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, U.S. policy towards Iran for the last 3 decades has primarily taken the form of economic sanctions, threats, and isolationism. While U.S. sanctions have been effective at hurting Iran's economy and ordinary Iranian people, it can be argued that U.S. policy over the last 30 years has not been effective at creating any meaningful change in the conduct of the Iranian government. And I ask unanimous consent to include in the record a reprint from Foreign Affairs magazine, November 2011, which cites the ineffectiveness of the United States sanctions policy.
Without objection, so ordered.
U.S. policy towards Iran has failed to ensure a peaceful Iran that aids regional security. Yet today we are considering legislation that significantly restricts any efforts by the U.S. government, including members of Congress, to engage Iran diplomatically, and it further hurts ordinary Iranian people by imposing indiscriminate sanctions. Proponents of the Iran Threat Reduction Act claim that it's a last-ditch effort to prevent military confrontation with Iran. Yet this bill takes away the most effective tool to prevent war, diplomacy, as the United States only now begins to extricate itself from the highly questionable military campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. We cannot allow the United States to be plunged into yet another disastrous war. I oppose nuclear proliferation for military purposes for all countries and believe that sanctions have proven to be a failed policy. We must rely on diplomacy, not outlaw it, and take steps and avoid taking steps which push us closer to military confrontation. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this bill may represent our last chance to find a peaceful means to pressure the Iranian regime into stopping its nuclear weapons program. Within the next year, possibly in the next 6 months, this program may become irreversible unless we act now. We know that sanctions are having an impact in Iran. President Ahmadinejad recently said that Iranian banks, quote, cannot make international transactions anymore. Just this weekend, Iran's central bank governor said, quote, the situation of sanctions is harder than a physical fight. With this bill before us today, we intend to make his fight much harder. No sanctions can be deemed truly effective until Iran ends its nuclear weapons program. We know that Iran is steadily increasing its stockpile of low-enriched uranium, moving its centrifuges to a hardened underground facility, making progress in other ways towards a nuclear weapons capability. We need to do more and faster. H.R. 1905 builds on past efforts by imposing sanctions on foreign commercial enterprises that do business with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, by widening the scope of sanctions on human rights abusers, and by other means. But one of the most important elements of this bill is my measure to impose sanctions on Iran's central bank, which provides key financial support for Iran's nuclear weapons and terrorism activities. This measure would cut Iran entirely off from the world's banking system, dealing an unprecedented blow to Iran's economy. This may cause short-term difficulties for the world's oil market, and it may rankle some of our allies, but it is necessary because stopping Iran's nuclear program is of paramount strategic importance, and we're running out of time. Mr. Speaker, our absolute goal must be to stop Iran's nuclear weapons program. That's the goal of this bill. We may have only a few more months to deal peacefully with this crisis. There is no time to lose. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Ohio.
I ask unanimous consent to put in the record an article from the Washington Post Ombudsman entitled Getting Ahead of the Facts on Iran, which states, quotes, and says that the IAEA report does not say Iran has a bomb, nor does it say it is building one.
Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent to include in the record an article, Experts Cast Doubt on Iran's Sanction Strategy, which raises questions about the Iranian stockpile and how much enriched uranium they actually have.
Without objection, so ordered.
I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, distinguished Congressman, Mr. Blumenauer.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I appreciate the gentleman's courtesy in permitting me to speak on the bill. We will postulate that Iran has been a terrible actor, that having nuclear weapons is a threat to international stability and something that we should resist. I am concerned about the legislation that is before us being potentially counterproductive on 2 areas. It's not something that we ought to be coming forward with here at 8:15 at night on the unanimous consent calendar. There are legitimate issues here, and there is controversy. My friend from California said, well, there may be disruptions in the oil markets.
Well, I think of what has motivated people in terms of their concern about what has happened. According to an article in the Wall Street Journal, new sanctions could raise the price of gas in the United States by $1 a gallon. An article in the New York Times estimated it could cost Americans $100 billion a year. This is not inconsequential. At a time when our economy is in tough shape, when we are concerned about being able to move forward, we ought to think carefully about doing something. Now, if it would stop nuclear weapons for Iran, it might be worth it. There's no evidence that that is the case. I mean, we look only at the failed policy with Cuba, where we have had massive efforts at sanctioning Cuba, a little tiny island off the American coast. And what we have done, most independent experts agree, is that we've propped up Castro. We've given him a reason. If we had been freely trading, interacting with the Cuban people, I think Castro would have been a thing of the past. Being careful about what we do with Iran matters. But I'm deeply concerned about language here that would prohibit any official or unofficial capacity having United States contact, no person employed by the United States contacting in an official or unofficial capacity. Thinking about, on your time, I'd be happy to yield. I'm going to be on my time if I have time.
You're not right.
My reading of this, that it is inappropriate to tie the hands of the administration to require 15 days notice, to exercise the waiver authority. Where we have been successful in the past, for example, in diffusing a real nuclear problem with Cuba, there was actual engagement with the administration. President Kennedy and others were able to work dealing with the real problem, dealing with the Soviet Union, our adversaries, people who could actually destroy us. I am deeply concerned that we not forestall opportunities to engage in diplomacy, which needs to be a part of any reasonable sanction policy going forward, trying to deal with Iran. From my vantage point, I think we need to be careful about how we move forward dealing with sanctions policies. Sanctions first, ask questions later. My hope is that we'll have an opportunity to deal with this issue with the gravity that it requires, have interaction on the floor, be careful about what we're doing going forward with the economic impacts, and the fact that it very well likely further embolden this administration, the administration of Iran. I don't think that's something that is appropriate to us, and I'd be happy to yield to my friend.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Or if he wants to yield on his own time, I'd be happy to pursue it.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves the balance of his time. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady so recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, a nuclear Iran is unacceptable. Our fundamental strategic objective must be to stop Iran before it obtains nuclear weapons capabilities and to compel it to permanently dismantle its pursuit of such weapons. That is the test we face, and if we fail, it will come as no consolation to the families of the victims of past and future Iranian attacks or to our allies. We don't know how much time we have left. In its report on Iran's nuclear program last November, the International Atomic Energy Agency stated that not only has Iran continued to make significant progress regarding its nuclear program, but the IAEA said that it had uncovered solid evidence that Iran has been working on a nuclear explosive device as well. Given the Iranian regime's history of concealing its clandestine nuclear activities, Tehran may very well be closer to a nuclear weapons capability than we even assume. Some estimates now place a mere 6 months to a year away from having all of the ingredients in place to build a nuclear weapon. Every day they move closer and closer to realizing their nuclear ambitions, and our nightmare scenario moves closer and closer to becoming a reality. The Iranian regime is not interested in any outcome other than a nuclear Iran, though they are happy to use negotiations to buy time to make progress in their nuclear program. Yet we know that when sanctions have been applied, even limited sanctions, they have had an impact on the Iranian regime. It is time to build on this lesson and apply crippling sanctions against the regime and its enablers. That is the purpose of the bill before us, the Iran Threat Reduction Act, which our Foreign Affairs Committee adopted unanimously last month. This legislation updates and strengthens previous Iran sanctions laws so that the United States can take effective action to address the multiple threats posed by the regime in Tehran. The bill closes loopholes in the energy and financial sanctions that are in place now and counters the regime's efforts to evade them, including by targeting the Central Bank of Iran. The bill also focuses on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and the senior Iranian regime officials. Over 350 members of Congress have co-sponsored this strongly bipartisan legislation. Let us meet our responsibilities to the American people and to protect the security of our nation from this growing threat. With that, I reserve the balance of our time.
The gentlelady reserves the balance of her time. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
I realize, Mr. Speaker, that there are a number of people who want to speak on this from who are in favor of this resolution, and in order to make sure that everyone's provided the chance, though I may disagree with what Mr. Sherman is about to say, I'll defend his right to speak, and so I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
The gentleman from California is recognized. 4 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for his generous grant of time, especially because he will probably disagree with almost everything I have to say. I'd like to thank Chairman Ileana Ross-Layton for bringing together the best ideas of so many members and, of course, of her own to move toward another important step toward dissuading Iran from developing nuclear weapons, and for her ability to build a coalition that has over 300 members co-sponsoring this bill. We have to create circumstances where the regime in Tehran has to choose between its nuclear weapons program and regime survival. We owe a special debt of gratitude to the mullahs who are running Iran, because it is their incompetence and their corruption that creates a risk to regime survival even at a time of very high oil prices. And we owe a debt of gratitude to the Iranian people who rose up against this regime in the summer of 2009 and whose desire for freedom poses a real threat to regime survival. Looking at the particulars of this bill, I want to thank the chairwoman for including in this bill, in Title III, provisions dealing with the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps. These are based on the Revolutionary Guard Corps Designation Implementation Act, which I introduced in 2009, along with the chairwoman and Ed Royce and Dan Burton. This Title III makes it clear to foreign companies that if they do business with the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps, they cannot do business in the United States. I also want to thank the chairwoman for co-sponsoring both last year and this year my bill, the Stop Iran's Nuclear Program Act, and for including many of those provisions in this legislation that's before us today. In particular, including provision that would sanction those companies that loan money to Iran, whether in dollars or in euros or any other currency, that tell the foreign incorporated subsidiaries of U.S. multinational corporations that they, too, cannot do business with Iran. To build upon the provision that Chuck Schumer and I were able to write and was included in CISADA, which was adopted last year, to indicate that those who give Iran the technologies to suppress the Internet and to apprehend dissidents through the Internet will be sanctioned. Companies should not be providing that kind of technology to Iran. Now this law requires, or this bill would require the State Department to actually implement those provisions by designating the technologies that cannot be sold to Iran. And finally, this bill includes the provision of the Stop Iran Nuclear Weapons Program Act that allows states to do even more to help this federal policy by providing that those insurance companies that are helping Iran may not be able to do business in their particular state. Finally, I want to point out that this bill includes provisions aimed at the Central Bank of Iran, but that is not a reason for us not to also pass the Menendez-Kirk language that's in the Defense Authorization Bill. The Menendez-Kirk language would, like this bill, sanction those U.S. banks that violate our law by doing business with Iran, and would freeze those assets that the Central Bank of Iran has foolishly left in the United States, or may have done so. But the key thing about the Kirk-Menendez language is it tells European and Asian and other non-U.S. banks that they must stop their business with the Central Bank of Iran and virtually all the major banks of Iran as well. It imposes secondary sanctions. And I believe the Kirk-Menendez language will make it difficult for Iran to sell oil or to buy anything with its oil revenue. I urge the passage of this bill, the Kirk-Menendez language, and other sanctions against Iran, and I yield back.
That's my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the Democratic whip for the House, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I thank Mr. Berman for yielding. I also want to thank Mr. Berman and my dear friend Ileana Ros-Lehtinen for their leadership on this bill. I know that Mr. Berman in particular is very focused on the central bank and sanctioning of them, and so I thank him for his leadership. Mr. Speaker, last month the IAEA released a report on Iran's covert nuclear program that was troubling, to say the least. Not only is Iran continuing to enrich uranium, but they're also believed to be pursuing the development of delivery technologies to create a warhead that could threaten Israel and our allies in Europe and the Persian Gulf, not to mention the over 200,000 Americans that are in the region. On top of these dangerous risks, Iran's continued nuclear development runs the risk, of course, of launching a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Indeed, just last week, a former Saudi Arabian ambassador to the United States, Prince Turki al-Faisal, confirmed our worst fears, suggesting that his country might begin to pursue a nuclear capability in response to Iranian nuclear developments. Iran has continued its sponsorship of terrorism against our ally Israel and carries out gross human rights abuses against its own people. Sanctions against Iran's energy, transportation, and financial sectors are intended, and I believe will, make clear to Iran the steep costs of its choices. That is why I'm in strong support of this resolution. The Iran Threat Reduction Act and the Iran, North Korea, and Syria Nonproliferation Reform and Modernization Act, and I urge my colleagues to vote yes on both. We know from history that ignoring the threats of leaders, ignoring their building up of capabilities to threaten the rest of the world, is done so at great peril and at great cost. I urge my colleagues to support this very important piece of legislation. And I thank Mr. Berman and Ms. Ileana Ros-Lehtinen.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Could I ask, Mr. Speaker, how much time all parties have remaining?
The gentleman from Ohio has 9 3/4 minutes. The gentleman from California has 6 minutes. And the gentlelady from Florida has 3.5 minutes. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent to include in the record an article from the Arms Control Association which states that the IAEA board resolution avoided direct censure of Iran and did not declare Iran to be in noncompliance with its nonproliferation activities.
Without objection, so ordered.
My friend from Oregon earlier mentioned the question of oil prices, and it's something that we ought to be concerned about. I ask unanimous consent to put in the record an article up from Slate that says that this sanction could lead to an increase in the price of gasoline that could be as much as $1.25 a gallon.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, an article in the Wall Street Journal raises this question as well. It says that crude flirts with $100 a barrel on geopolitical unrest, and it also quotes a commodity strategist at the Standard Bank in London as saying the timing of an Iranian embargo could hardly be worse. Relatively small disruptions could cause spikes in oil prices. A director of the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, Mr. Adam Zubin, stated that there are real scenarios in which an oil spike might hit. This is from an article. U.S. officials warned that new sanctions could be a boon to Iran. And there's another article that cites that, and an article from the New York Times which states that U.S. officials have declared they'd hold Iran accountable for a purported plot, but they've now decided that a proposed move against Iran's central banks would disrupt international oil markets and further damage the reeling American and world economies. I think that's something that we ought to be concerned about, that if in fact we are moving forward with sanctions which will have an effect on the price of oil, is this the timing to do that kind of thing? And are we prepared in this Congress to accept the responsibility for a sharp increase in the price of oil? Here's a quote from a blog called San Francisco Gate, quoting the Undersecretary of State Wendy Sherman told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, quote, "There's absolutely a risk the price of oil would go up, which would mean that Iran would in fact have more money to fuel its nuclear ambitions, not less." I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from California.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to a senior member of the committee, a leader in these efforts for many years, the ranking member of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, Mr. Engel.
Gentleman from New York.
I thank the gentleman. I rise in strong support of this legislation. Under no circumstances should Iran be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon. This is a dangerous regime which supports terrorism and calls for the destruction of Israel. And every day they're getting closer to weaponizing its stockpile of enriched uranium. No amount of naivete or wishful thinking will get the Iranian regime to back down. They're liars, and diplomacy hasn't worked and won't work. They'll only play for time. We heard the same arguments about not putting sanctions on the apartheid regime in South Africa. Now we hear that oil is going to go sky high. Well, you know what? I think morality is more important than the price of oil. I think morality says that this terrible regime should not be allowed to have nuclear weapons, should not be allowed to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, should not be allowed to do the horrible things that it does. This important bill opposes tough sanctions on Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and against the Central Bank of Iran, and the Iranians have to know our sanctions will only be increased if they don't back off soon. We have bipartisan support here. People say Congress doesn't work together. We work together on this. This is important. We need to pass this bill.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Ohio.
I would respectfully respond to my friend from New York that the price of oil is in fact a moral question. I want to yield myself a minute. I want to raise the question of the constitutionality of this particular proposal. I believe that it's unconstitutional because It is an unconstitutional abridgment of freedom of speech and freedom of association. It is an unconstitutional abridgment of the right of free expression by federal employees. It is a violation of whistleblower protections which have been granted a constitutional basis, that in fact it violates our own speech and debate clause of the Constitution of the United States, because we have an obligation to inquire and to ask questions, that it violates the Constitution, separation of power, and challenges the President's power to engage in foreign diplomacy, that it is operationally impossible, that you can have even Admiral McMullen, former chair of the Joint Chiefs, points out that with the miscommunications that can occur from a lack of diplomacy, we could be putting our own people at risk. In fact, there was an article that was published that deals with a scenario that would happen if in the Gulf, where there's run-ins between American and Iranian vessels, the no-contact provision, if enacted, could outlaw the U.S. Navy's bridge-to-bridge communications with Iranian vessels. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Florida? Or gentleman from California. Sorry about that.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to someone who's provided a major contribution to this legislation that's now before the House, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the ranking member, my friend Mr. Berman. The legislation before us today will give the United States the tools to impose the most stringent, the most crippling sanctions aimed at cracking down on what is the greatest threat to international security, a nuclear-armed Iran. The Iran Threat Reduction Act builds on the already significant steps this Congress took, along with our partners in the EU and at the United Nations last year, to dramatically ratchet up pressure on the Iranian regime in order to thwart its illicit quest for nuclear weapons. The bill comes on the heels of the IAEA report that confirmed what we already knew. The Iranian regime is pursuing nuclear weapons. It comes on the heels of the foiled Iranian assassination plot and the dangerous attack coordinated by the regime on the British embassy. And it comes even as the Iranian regime contributes to the brutal crackdown on the Syrian people that has left over 5,000 dead, so that the regime can continue to use Syria as a conduit for routing weapons to Hezbollah and Hamas to be used against Israel. Mr. Speaker, I am proud to have authored 2 provisions contained in this bill, and I'd like to thank the bill's sponsors, Chairman Ross-Leighton and Ranking Member Berman, for working with me to include the Iran Transparency and Accountability Act and the Iran Human Rights and Democracy Promotion Act. The requirements of these provisions put the onus of determining the extent and nature of a company's involvement in Iran on that company by requiring the disclosure of all material business with Iran on its SEC filings. This forced disclosure will accelerate the imposition of sanctions. Mr. Speaker, this legislation also includes mandatory sanctions on those who perpetrate the most egregious human rights abuses. This regime's use of intimidation and brutality to suppress its opposition must be stopped, and the United States must stand with the people of Iran in their quest for democracy and for freedom. Mr. Speaker, a nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable, and we cannot permit it to happen. We must make it clear that we are serious, determined, and aggressive in our approach to halt Iran's illegal, destabilizing, and dangerous pursuit of weapons of mass destruction.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Ohio.
I ask unanimous consent to include in the record an article by Seymour Hersh which cites the IAEA's report suggesting, according to the Arms Control Association, that Iran is working to shorten the time frame to build the bomb once and if it makes the decision, but it remains apparent that a nuclear-armed Iran is still not imminent, nor is it inevitable.
Objection, so ordered. Without objection, so ordered.
I would ask how much time is left on all sides.
Ohio has 6 minutes. The lady from Florida has 3.5.
And the gentleman from California?
And the gentleman from California has 3.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, an esteemed member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce.
Gentleman from Texas.
I thank the Chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and the Ranking Member for the opportunity to speak here tonight on H.R. 1905. And Mr. Speaker, I rise tonight in strong support of H.R. 1905, the Iran Threat Reduction Act. While Iranian leadership continues to give public assurances that their nuclear program is for peaceful purposes, their words don't match their actions. A recent International Atomic Energy Agency report makes it clear that Iran is developing advanced delivery systems for nuclear weapons. Mr. Speaker, the only reason why Iran would develop advanced delivery systems is to have the means to deliver a nuclear bomb on peaceful neighbors like Israel. This outcome is unacceptable, and the United States must continue to enact tougher sanctions to ensure that this never happens. H.R. 1905 will add new sanctions targeting the Central Bank of Iran, making it difficult for foreign companies to do business with Iran. H.R. 1905 will also increase sanctions on members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Mr. Speaker, the biggest threat to world peace is the religious fanatics in Iran having a nuclear bomb. Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons simply cannot happen, not on our watch. I implore my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation which will force Iran to abandon its quest for nuclear weapons. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from Florida reserves her time. Gentleman from Ohio.
I ask unanimous consent to include in the record a letter from 26 organizations that urge Congress to oppose the provision restricting contact with Iranian officials.
Without objection, so ordered.
You know, it's interesting that what we're actually suggesting here is taking diplomacy off the table. I was here for the debate in Iraq. I led the effort in this Congress in challenging the then Bush administration's assertions that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction which they intended to use against the United States. I was here. I don't know how many of you were here, but I saw a case being made for war, and that case was based on exaggerations and, unfortunately, in some cases, distortions and lies. We have to be very careful about the consequences of this debate. We have to be very careful that we're not setting the stage for still another war. We must be very careful that when we assert a certain level of preparedness on the part of Iran with respect to their nuclear capability, that we aren't actually shutting the door that needs to be open in order to try to resolve any difficulty between our nations. We can say, well, we want to get them back to the table, but then don't talk to them. Reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to one of the co-founder of the Iran Working Group, someone who has brought the issue of Iran, its policies, and particularly its nuclear weapons program to the attention of this body and the public, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Andrews.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute. Without objection.
I'd like to thank the chair lady from Florida and the ranking member, Mr. Berman, from California, for their very forceful and effective advocacy. Iran made a choice to ignore international standards and comity and secretly develop a nuclear weapon. Iran made a choice to eschew sincere diplomatic efforts to come up with a deal, an agreement, where they could have their civilian nuclear energy program, but have the fuel manufactured outside of Iran. Now Iran must, in my view, be confronted with the choice as to whether it will enjoy economic stability or give up its nuclear weapons ambition. I think the time is here to force that choice upon the Iranians. I think it's unfortunate it has to be done, but it has to be done. We cannot let the world's most horrific weapon to fall into the hands of one of the world's most horrendous regimes. For that reason, I strongly support the legislation by Ms. Ross-Lehtinen, Mr. Berman, and urge a yes vote.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California reserves his time. Gentleman from Ohio.
I want to say I have great respect for all my colleagues who are concerned about nuclear proliferation. We all ought to be concerned about nuclear proliferation. We can start with our own country. You know, right now, we've set the stage for continuing to develop nuclear weapons. It's very difficult to be able to have a strong position of standing on this issue if we have one set of rules for ourselves and another set of rules for the rest of the world. I don't want to see a nuclear proliferation in Iran, but I think that if we want to have a standing where people want to take what we say, we have to be consistent with what we have to make sure that what we do is consistent with what we say. Reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Ohio.